Hello, and welcome to The Strange Dominions, where we attempt to unlock the mysteries behind the unseen and unheard, unknown and unknowable. I am your host, Octavian Graves. First, I'd like to say I sincerely apologize for the way I sound. I'm getting over a cold. I'm still a little snuffly and congested, but the show goes on as always. Tonight, we're very excited to bring this next guest to you. I've been waiting to do this one for a long time. So Ian and I speak with Daniel Harms, and Daniel is an author, scholar, and librarian. He has put out such books as The Book of Oberon, The Long Lost Friend, The Witch Bottle, Angels, Demons, and Spirits, Fairy Queens, The Necronomicon Files, The Cthulhu Mythos Encyclopedia, and much, much more. We are interviewing him tonight to talk about his new book, The Book of Four Occult Philosophers. It's a very fascinating grimoire, and it's all sourced from the Daus 116 manuscript. It covers fairy magic, spirit conjurations, spells, rituals, and so much more. We go into the four philosophers who penned this manuscript over a period of 300 years and some of the overall history regarding this manuscript. There is a Patreon segment to this episode, and we delve more into fairy magic and Daniel's Lovecraft fascination. As always, the Patreon is only $4 a month to sign up. You get extra episodes, ad-free episodes, the opportunity to be on the show, and much, much more. If you have seen something strange or unusual, such as a cryptid, spirit, UFO, or anything in between, please send us an email at strangedominionspodcast@gmail.com. We are going to be getting away from author interviews and getting more into witness interviews, so if you would like to be on the show to talk about things you have experienced, please send us an email. We would love to have you on. Without further ado, we bring you our interview with Daniel Harms. All right, tonight, Ian and I are here with Daniel Harms. Now, Daniel has written or compiled a new book called The Book of Four Occult Philosophers, and he has put out many books before this, including the legendary Book of Oberon, Angels, Spirits, and Demons, The Witch Bottle, The Cthulhu Encyclopedia, and The Long Lost Friend, including others. So, Daniel, it is so good to have you. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Very good. Yeah, we're very excited to have you on. So I wanted to have you on before this to talk about the Book of Oberon, because that is such a incredible book with so many really, really special tidbits of information for the practicing magician. And I would like to have you on again to talk about that specifically. But this new one, the Book of Four Occult Philosophers, it's such an interesting concept. And I wanted to read the intro here because the way that you write it is very story-like, and it just kind of wraps up the whole thing in this very mysterious Lovecraftian aura. So,
and I appreciate that writing style myself. Honestly, I know whenever I'm doing a little bit of writing, especially on occult things, and it becomes, it's time to frame it. I like to frame it as a story too, and I know that my Lovecraft influences seep into that. It's just, I blame the entirety of Charles Dexter Ward.
Yeah.
And so my question is, how did you come across the manuscript, which is Daus 116, and how did you get started with actually compiling this information together into this book?
So, one of the things to keep in mind is that a lot of these manuscripts, somebody knows about them and has looked at them at some point in the past. So in my particular case, there was actually an article on the Bodleian Library Record, I believe is the name of the journal. And the author, that Stephanie Pope, was talking about this. She was somebody who was working at this from a manuscript perspective. I tend to come at things from a scholar of magic perspective, which means that I don't know, there's some elements of, paleography and being able to describe a manuscript that I am less comfortable with, but I'm also more familiar with everything that's out there. So she was coming at it from like a manuscript perspective, and I was like, I was looking through what she had put out there. I was like, wait a minute, this is actually pretty long, and it's pretty, it's pretty interesting. It's got a lot of things in there, some of which I recognize and some of which I don't. And so I decided that I talked to Joe Peterson about this because we correspond from time to time, and we decided to maybe order a copy of some of it from the Bodleian, because we checked the Bodleian rates and they were astronomical. In a lot of cases, like these magical manuscripts have been microfilmed before. So it's possible that this is a tip for your listeners. It is possible to just get in touch with the British Library and ask them, hey, have you microfilmed this? And they'll say yes. And then you can order it and it'll be, $20, $25. And you can just get a copy of that manuscript, which is really nice. This one had not gone through that process.
Yeah, I didn't know you could do that. That's really good information. I'm going to have to utilize that myself.
Yeah, I would write them first and ask them at their research inquiries desk, and then you can send it on, because sometimes things get a little bit confused, and and then you end up paying a lot of money for them. But in this particular case, we could order maybe a fourth of it, and when we started looking at it, saying, yeah, there's something interesting here. So I decided to follow up. I'd been making trips to the UK to look at various manuscripts, and so I decided to go to the Bodleian and check this one out. And it turned out that this was something different. Miss Pope had identified 3 authors in the manuscript who had, who had basically contributed to it at different times. And then I was looking at it, and I'm like, wait a minute, I think I found a 4th, and I was able to confirm that. So as it went along, it was, I was finding out more and more, which is why the book was at one point the book of 3 wizards, and then became the book of 4 wizards was the working title, and now it's the book of 4 occult philosophers. But it was kind of a neat process of going there, and just one of the nice things about these modern libraries is they're very open with the material. They don't want you to publish like images from it for the most part, but they want you get in and use the collection. So I just went in and took all sorts of photographs of the manuscript, and was able to take those back home and say, yeah, this is something special. And there's material in this that's unique. And not all of it's unique, because a lot of these are, they're referring to other manuscripts, but and other printed works. But this one, this has enough to really, bring something to the table that people haven't seen before.
Absolutely, and there is such a wealth of information, and I think that the whole story behind it is really compelling and interesting. Can you talk a little bit about these 4 authors? And first off, who do you feel is the predominant contributor to this book? Because it seems that there's one that contributes much more to it than the rest, whereas the others kind of put in a little bit here and a little there. Which one do you feel is the most prominent of the 4?
Well, the bad news is the most prominent of the 4 is the earliest, and the one we don't know as much about. It's one of the features of these manuscripts is that we tend to think of like books having titles, because we're used to that. That's what, you go into you look at your bookshelf, pretty much everything there is has somebody's name on it. Though at this time, people were much less likely to put their names on these manuscripts, for perhaps because they were just concerned about, being able to be clearly linked with them. I mean, if the authorities raid your home and find them, then you're stuck with it. But otherwise, maybe if it's in circulation, which a lot of them were, people were passing manuscripts back and forth. So if the authorities find a manuscript and it doesn't have your name on it, well, what are they going to do? Maybe it's yours, maybe it's not. So this person does seem to have been is nameless, but we do know a little bit about them. They did live at about, I think there's a date in the manuscripts at about 1697 or 98 on one of the examples. And this is one thing that will happen. Sometimes they'll copy material from another book, but then they'll put in, personalized material, like maybe a name or maybe, a date in this particular case of something happening. And in this case, there's that's the very late date. We also know it was probably, well, this is my best guess. It's probably somewhere near Worcester, the English town. And there's a few different reasons for that. One of which is that there's one little variant on a charm which only comes from that area. And another is that there are references to, I think, one of the local, a local clergyman in it. And finally, there's that reference to that treasure hunting rite we talked about. And I was very excited by that because I realized they had put the name of the place they went to hunt treasure into that rite. And, a lot of times it's very, very vague. It's like, well, where I'm just going to go to this place and we're going to use this incantation. There's nothing personalized about it. But in this one, they put in the name of the place. And there's only one place known in England that has that explicit name. It's called Stolton Heath. And there are like 3 other Stoltons we know about. So maybe there's like a sort of an uninhabited sort of land where they don't do agriculture near one of them, which could also be a Stolton Heath. But this seems to be it. It seems like those clues kind of came together. So I wish I knew more about this person, but that seems to be about as much as I could determine. Especially when I was getting to the point where I could try to figure that out. I was like, okay, I'm going to go into our archives. I'm going to look up some stuff. And then the pandemic hit. I was like, okay. I did ask around for people to say, hey, do you recognize this handwriting? But nobody really did. So that's about as much as we know about that first author, which is sort of a shame. But, it's a bit of a mystery. Maybe someone will solve it someday.
Absolutely. And I really hope they do, because they definitely put a lot of work into this. And you could tell that do you get the sense that they were really practicing all the things that they had written down? Or do you feel that, because that's how it seems to me, it seems like they were doing this from experience.
This is always a tricky question because it's hard to tell, It's like today. Some people get books like this in order to practice the magic in it, and some people get it just because they're kind of interested. So knowing what people are practicing and what they aren't is sometimes, it's tricky to determine. But the fact that we have that treasure hunting incantation with the name of the place in it, that's kind of tips it over to, yes, this person was interested in practicing magic, whether or not they actually went out to Stolton Heath at some point and tried to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that brings us to the second occult philosopher, which was Thomas Harrington. And this kind of goes into sort of the name of the book about, and its reference to the book of, the fourth book of occult philosophy. Maybe you could talk a little bit about him and that whole story.
I'm actually going to quickly pull it out because I want to make sure I'm a little bit more. Well, actually, while I'm looking for him, just to give some impression, this is one of the curses of doing historical research is dealing with a whole bunch of people who are named Thomas or George or, something very common. And so Thomas Harrington sort of falls into that particular category. What we know is that we have a catalog of his library that went on sale in 1806 after his death. And we know from that he was a major, occult collector and somebody who was very much interested in this material. He had a huge library of printed works. He had some other manuscript works, and this particular book was one of a few different ones. We don't know quite which Thomas Harrington that was. There was one who sort of dropped dead in a London park at one point, so that could be him. But aside from that, this is about as much as we know. We know what's in his library, but then again, if you know what's in somebody's library, that also can often give you a pretty good portrait of what that person was like and where their interests were.
Now, what time frame was this?
This is that catalog dates to 1806. So a little ways before that, he probably passed away, and then so that's about as much as we have. Sometimes this data is not as quite as complete as we would like,
so
especially when we're dealing with older material. Yeah,
not quite exact, but usually at least the general.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
And what's really interesting is first, could you give a little bit of information about what you think he actually added to the manuscript? And then if you could give him just, because I like the way that you put it. So you have the actual, the potential philosopher who was involved, and then you have the century in which they were around and writing in, and how that differs from the rest. So Thomas Harrington was the 18th century, and maybe you could go into a little bit about why that is significant.
Well, one of the things about the 18th century is that, and early 19th century, is that there's a whole different sort of view towards magic. The first author of this book was writing at the very tail end of that grand, fluorescence of ritual magic in the 16th and 17th centuries, when people were, really taking it seriously. There's a huge amount of manuscripts. And then sort of this whole idea came about, and we're not quite sure how it came about actually, that, all of this was superstitious nonsense and you shouldn't really worry about it. And it just made, it was just something that silly people believed in. And so what happened for those who were practicing it is they started to have to come up with justifications. So one of the things that Thomas Harrington's trying to do in his copy is, first of all, he's the one who gives it the unofficial copy, title we did not use, which was The Key to Agrippa, because we thought that would just be confusing. But he said, he has his own introduction where he talks about, well, this is something that is, along the lines of mesmerism. It's something that's, for the initiate to explore. And he also, so he's talking about that. He's kind of setting it up that way. He is also adding some more material of his own. He starts writing out passages about, dreams and performing the preparations for various sorts of rites. And it sounds as if what he was hoping would happen was he would be able to pass this manuscript on to somebody else who would then be able to pick it up and, continue in his line of work, which did not happen because everything got auctioned off. And as I said, he had some other manuscripts. I do not know where those are anymore. But he was also a practitioner. I can say that. There's a point where you've got a design called the Wheel of Pythagoras or the Wheel of Apuleius. This turns up in a lot of different manuscripts. It's like a way of determining whether somebody who's sick is going to die or get well, or various sorts of prognostications like that. And in this particular one, he wrote the values of his initials in the side, because one of the first things you do is you add up the value of the letters in your name. So he just kind of wrote that in there. He didn't actually wrote his entire name out, but I was able to sit there and say, okay, so if it adds up to this amount, then it's going to be, these values. Okay. Harrington works out for that. So he was practicing, he was interested in from that perspective. But he was he never got to really see this achieve what he wanted to do. And I'm hoping that in some way this book sort of does that. So suddenly what he was hoping to pass on to somebody else is now going to all sorts of people.
Yeah. And I just actually asked Marcus Ironwood from Llewellyn to send me the full copy, because this is an unfinished copy, just for reviewing purposes. But there's a lot of rights that I'm very interested in actually experimenting with and trying out. And I know this isn't exactly on topic, but in the other works that you've done, whether it be The Long Lost Friend or The Book of Oberon or Angels, Demons, and Spirits, have you gotten people writing to you saying that they've tried out some of the experiments in these books and what their results have been?
I'm trying to think if anybody has, and I can't recall anybody right now, and I probably wouldn't want to give their story without their permission.
Right. Yes, of course.
But I know that people really, at one point somebody told me they were considering doing a queer invocation of Oberon. So I was like, okay, all right, yeah, let me know how it goes. I didn't hear back, so I'm hoping it went well. But I know that these are, often there's a lot of inspirational material in this that I hope people are, appreciate, can get something out of.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in the Book of Oberon, there's a lot of techniques in there that I'm very keen to try out. Now, when it comes to, so the original author, you believe the only information we really have concretely is that their initial was W. So that was in the late 1600s, and then Thomas Harrington had this in the early 1800s. So you don't feel that there was any kind of contact between W and Thomas Harrington in the transmission between the two.
I mean, let's think about this. So the person was probably, would probably have to be our first author would have had to be in their 20s. So, maybe in 1850, they're 70. It's vaguely possible, but there's a lot of the story with regard to the transmission of these manuscripts that we often just don't know because people don't, leave their mark in the books. Like Oberon, there are just huge gaps of probably maybe like I want to say 150 years. We don't know anything about who had the book. We can. It is possible. It would be nice to think that these two people sat down and had a conversation, but it's hard to tell.
Because that does appear with the later authors or contributors to the book, where there was evidence that they had been in contact with each other.
Yes. So shall we get to them?
Yes, absolutely. So after Thomas Harrington, we have Princess Olive, and she has a very, very interesting story. Maybe you could go into her background and sort of the controversy that she had before she got a hold of this manuscript.
Well, Olivia Saras is probably she was the one I discovered because I just found her signature scrawled in a corner someplace in a couple places. Like, okay, this is an interesting person, and she is fascinating. She was Olivia Saras, I believe that's how her name's pronounced, and she was actually a painter. I think she was a painter to the royal family at one point, in fact. And what she became convinced of was that she was actually the child of the Duke of Cumberland, I believe. And she had some material, that she had found that indicated this, or that she had created. It's not clear. And so what she did is she would just started to go around and proclaim herself, the princess, and try to get, special dispensations and try to be able to use the royal coat of arms on a carriage. And the royal family seems to have treated this very carefully. And part of this was that she kept getting into these situations where she would go to representatives of the royal family and say, hey, there are these people who want to release all sorts of dirt on the royal family, and I can help you out with that. You can just give me some money because, I'm just being helpful here, but I also have expenses, So I think that this is unlikely that this was the case. I think even the supporters of Olivia Saras as a potential princess who lost her inheritance also agree that there's some of this documentation which is kind of shady. And so when when even the proponents can't justify everything, well, that's kind of tilts you in a particular direction. She was also very much involved in astrology. She actually wrote for some of the astrological periodicals at the time. And what this book actually reveals is it wasn't just astrology. It was also she was practicing magic. She was interested in talismans and things of that sort. There's actually some talismans in there that she's written that are very interesting because I don't know where they come from. And they seem to be, I think it was Thebbet, the famous author on talismans, who these are credited to, but these don't show up in any other work by Thebbet I've been able to find out. So that's really interesting that she has access to something that we don't even know about today.
What? I don't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
I'm curious about that quite a bit. What are your personal theories on the source or her inspiration for the unknown talismans? Do you have any pet theories of your own?
I just think she had access to something that has gotten lost. I mean, there is so much material out there that has been lost, and that we don't, we have no idea where it's gone. I mean, she was part of that the occult scene at the time. She was corresponding with a good number of other occultists. There was really kind of this really interesting early 19th century sort of occult scene in London that we don't know about as much because a lot of people really concentrated on, Victorian era and the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley and all that. But, there was also this whole group of people who were, corresponding and copying and, engaging with the authors of that day, like Bulwer Lytton and Samuel Taylor Coleridge knew these people. I don't know how well, but they knew them. So there's a lot of things we just don't know about what they were doing and what manuscripts were around at the time. A lot of them, may be stuck in a trunk someplace, and I'm hoping that they show up someday.
That's what I'm thinking. Like, I hope we get, and I'm sure we will eventually, other things will be discovered. And I hope they do kind of prove to be a missing link to give us insight into that, into those communities of the time. Because, of course, in the last 100 years, the Golden Dawn has gotten, a lot more attention than perhaps some of these older groups who had even greater connection to grimoire roots and things like that. Even the source of the Golden Dawn, the cipher manuscript, which has long been, kind of considered more or less might have been a hoax. That actually might suggest the alternative explanation, that it might have its source in some of these quieter, more loosely organized, or we can't even say that, but less historically founded. Like we just don't have those manuscripts, but
and
there
I
had
think
to have
also,
been a wealth.
Also, those late 19th century figures were really systematizers. They were like, we're going to create our own sort of magic, and we're just going to bring together all sorts of material. And it doesn't, we don't know how well that really fits together. In many cases, it was based on their understanding of, say, Egyptian mythology at the time, which is
of course
not what our understanding is today. And I think that these earlier practitioners were very much more like, okay, we're going to assemble what we've got so far and kind of sort of set the stage for some of these people later on to be able to give them like a body of work from which they could draw. I think that a lot of, for example, a lot of Golden Dawn material, I won't say a lot of Golden Dawn material. I will get in trouble with Golden Dawn people if I say that. But Frederick Hockley was a manuscript collector who was very influential, with regard to that circle in which the Golden Dawn arose. And people really referred to his work. And Hockley was actually connected up with, these people before. There was a bookshop owner called John Denley who was famous. Supposedly, Bulwer Lytton said he was famous for not selling manuscripts. And what I think he was actually doing, it seems, based on some of his correspondence, was he was sending them out to people so they would copy them and then they'd send them back. So he was kind of serving as this kind of nexus for all these, copies of the Key of Solomon going out in various different works, being sold here and or reproduced here and there. And these, it would be fascinating to find out if they've got any caches of material that were just missed over time.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I found really interesting about how you kind of presented the information in this book is that the laws regarding magic changed so much throughout the time that this book is being worked on. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, about how the laws change and how that affects how people are writing down these kind of information.
Well, I'm not going to give a whole bunch of names and dates, so we're gonna make this very general. So, they're within the 16th and 17th century. So we're covering both Oberon and the Book of Four Occult Philosophers here. There were some pretty tough laws on the books about not necessarily owning a magical manuscript, but performing magic. Often things that were hostile, or doing something like hunting down treasure, which, of course, because treasure was in the ground, it was considered to be the property of the crown. So maybe you shouldn't be, messing with that. There were some exceptions. You could try to get a license. I think John Dee tried to get a license to hunt treasure and give some of it to the crown at some point, and they said no thanks. But if there are other things like the King James basically put in a law that kind of updated all of this early in his reign, and he included things like performing necromancy or digging up bodies and things like that. And we don't know why that went in there, but it did. What's important to remember, though, about these is that even though there were witch trials going on, there's a separation here sort of between witchcraft persecutions and, people practicing magic. Usually the people practicing magic were just usually told, like, stop, don't do that anymore. We're going to make you do peasants. We may kick you out of town. We're going to burn your books. But a lot of them were able to get away scot-free relatively. And there's relatively few records of trials. There's much fewer than you think. Part of that was because the people who are actually practicing magic were often doing things as well, like, healing people or acting in the absence of authorities to, say, track down thieves and things like that.
So it was more in favor of the cultural establishment.
Yeah.
Question: do you think it was more of a class thing where, because, most people know that many of the witch trial persecutions, probably were not, it was probably known that they were not actual witches they were going after, and it was likely more political or social enemies or people, things like that. Not to say that there were not, people at least they thought were witches that they persecuted for that reason. But what do you think the specific separation between the more, I guess, I don't even want to say noble art styles of magic and the more, you think it's like a peasant and kind of like the rural folk versus the more educated, or do you think it's something else?
I don't want to say, I don't think it's a rural versus urban divide, because there are these people practicing, in both settings.
Of course.
Does class have to do with it and in general, role in society? I'd say yes. And one of the things that people often think and was taught at one time was that people who practice magic were more likely to be prosecuted. But what we're seeing is that seems to be less likely, because these people had a role. They had a station in society. They were not necessarily the most, respected people in society, but they also weren't down at the level where, they were just, they were vagrants or anything. A lot of them were members of the community. They may not have been particular high status, but they were like artisans and people like that, who were doing this alongside the other sorts of tests that they were taking on as part of their regular jobs. So, so there's I want to get more into this, except that I just read a book about it, but I want to be really precise if I start talking about this. But that's kind of like that's the overall view.
Well, let's go talk about your works more here. And then I know we might do a Patreon episode, listeners. And if we have time later, I'd love to pick your brain about it. If you're
we did, but we left something off here. We left something off. Hold on. Which is like what happened, by the 1800s.
Of course.
By the 1800s, everyone had just decided, the authorities had just decided witchcraft was ridiculous. They had some very embarrassing witch trials that happened, and they said, okay, we're just going to start treating this more like fraud. It's not that we think you're going to cause any you're going to be able to summon up spirits and actually do anything, but you could still fool people.
Right. And, they're like, you guys are scam artists, and for that reason, we're going to come after you, less that you're going to invade the world with actual demons.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, that same dynamic was at play. So, people who were there in the community and were respectable members of the community would probably not be prosecuted much unless they, got involved in some sort of dispute, like somebody didn't like the result of, they said, we'll get this thief, and then that didn't work out. And that's where we find out about it, because people take them to court and then they argue with them, and then they kind of go back and forth, and sometimes the judge is just like, why are you were just dumb to think that this was going to happen anyway, so get out of here, your case is thrown out. So it's a similar dynamic, but there's a very different sort of rationale behind it, how people were treated, with regard to with how much there was public support for practicing magic and how much the elites were going to endorse that.
That's interesting, because there must be a correlation as the opinions on magic and these manuscripts moved towards the secular. That might have given the opportunity for some of these organizations and the people interested in them to kind of put that idea of almost a historical relevance to the reason why they are getting together and studying them, which must have been a great excuse to tell their friends and peers, like, oh, this is, this lodge is just, we drink beer, we look over history, and, we dig back a couple hundred years and things like that and study the silly pagans. But there might have been a lot more practical, magical work going on. But it must have been a clever, effective mask.
And that's what Thomas Harrington is very much doing.
Mm-hmm.
At the very beginning, he's trying to say, well, that this is very much we're studying, something that it corresponds with modern science. It corresponds with, what we're learning about the world, where there are still mysteries. And, thus, let's look into this, and let's respect that this is something that a lot of people used to believe in. I think makes reference at one point to, the biblical accounts of witches. So look at all these people who believed in witches. So why would they be wrong?
Yeah, wink, nudge.
Yeah.
Look at these guys. But
he's just trying to pull in a bunch of different threads to kind of justify this in a way that the original author just didn't need to. It's just like, okay, I can, call up spirits to find treasure. I'll just write that down.
But as you said it earlier, though, but he was himself likely a practitioner.
Oh, yes. But he had to approach it differently if he was looking at, presenting it to an audience than our original author would have.
Yeah, that train of thought just it gives an idea to the mindset, perhaps, of some of these authors and their peers in that generation.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and just before we get into the fourth occult philosopher, what was the time period in which Olivia Saras was operating in?
She was most active around, I don't have her dates in front of me, but it's like right around the 1820s.
Okay, all right.
She hangs on for quite a while, and then her basically after she dies, her daughter takes the whole thing to court, and basically the judges had been sort of tiptoeing around the whole thing, saying we don't have jurisdiction over this because if she is a member of the royal court, she shouldn't be here. But then after Olivia dies, then the judges feel like they can take on the case and say no, this is completely bogus.
I was wondering that
you're not going to get millions of dollars or pounds from the government.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that brings us to Robert Cross Smith, and I think he was the most interesting for me to read about because he's such an interesting character. I really appreciated the fact that, like, even at his funeral, the guy who was basically his best friend was like, he was a great guy, but he was also kind of a dick. He was very open about that, and I thought that was a very interesting aspect.
Yeah. So Robert Cross Smith is better known as Raphael. He came from a little town near Bristol, and he came to London and tried out various attempts to publish astrological works, and he finally hit it big with oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name of it, but he finally hit it big with one of his publications, and was able to then, just basically became like the celebrity astrologer of his time. Was creating all these almanacs, there was a lot of jealousy from.
Was that the straggling astrologer?
I think it's the one after the straggling astrologer.
Okay.
He had a lot of trouble getting traction originally. Yeah. But he's once again one of these people who knows John Denley and knows people like George Graham, who was a balloonist chiefly known for crashing his balloon many, many times.
Yeah, you just can't get away from the Grahams. I know.
Yeah,
they keep coming up in a lot of your works.
That's one of the books I forgot. I forgot the book on the Grahams, which is available solely on Amazon. It's maybe about $5. So if you're interested in reading a book about people who are astrologers and magicians and crash balloons a lot, that's the book for you. But yeah, so he's part of this circle. And he basically builds this whole publishing empire. So there's still people publishing under the name of Raphael, I think, today. There were probably something like 8 other Raphaels after him, people who just kept taking up the mantle and publishing. He was actually, he was actually one of the owners of the Book of Oberon too. Well, though it's kind of unclear about how much of an owner he was, but he had access to it appears, and he was publishing little excerpts of it here and there. So he was very much interested in these topics. And what we've got in the book is what seems to be 4 pages inserted that are, it's got a magical seal on it and a little bit of instruction to how to make it. And it's also got this weird little bit about how astrology is either going to go completely gangbusters by 1828, or it's going to basically fall off the map and no one's going to know about it at all, which neither of those actually happened. But it is interesting to kind of get his view of that, and also his views on the discovery of Uranus and how that fit into the astrological scheme, because that was something people were very much sort of trying to sort out at the time. It's like, okay, well, we got a new planet. Well, we didn't have that before. Let's see what are we going to do with that? So he is quite a fascinating figure.
Yeah, he really is. And so with him, that goes into what happens to the manuscript. And so he has this issue with the British Library.
Look, we're jumping a little ahead.
Oh, okay, my fault.
Dowse. This is Francis Dowse now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we can get to Francis Dowse though.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's dig into him.
Okay, so Francis Dowse was a man who at one point wanted to be very much a collector, and because there were major collectors at the time who would just go out and find all sorts of manuscripts and all sorts of pamphlets and all this sort of thing, and they make these massive collections. Sir Hans Sloane is the most famous of them, who his collection became the nucleus of today's British. Well, we've got the King James Library as part of it, but he really sort of puts it. Kind of was the impetus behind creating the British Museum, or now the British Library. Dowse was not as successful, and he kind of had a long period of time where his father didn't want him to mess around with this nonsense, and made him be a clerk for a while. He actually went to work for the British Library at one point, and he quit after a while, just because he just couldn't put up with like how cold the building was, and how annoying the committee work was, and how there was just too much work to do. It's pretty much what every librarian says these days.
I've identified with that position at work many times.
Yes, so he quit, and actually they wanted him back, but they couldn't get him. So he eventually, one of his a friend who was a sculptor passed away and left him a legacy enough so he could start actually collecting. So he went out and got a lot of material on all sorts of things like the Dance of Death, and materials on witchcraft. I think he only has this is the main book he has that's actually on magic. It seems to have been sort of this side purchase in a sense, maybe having more to do with the witchcraft material and the idea that there are people performing hostile magic. And this is why I think a lot of people just didn't notice this book to begin with, because it was just kind of off to the side. It's not like the Sloane manuscripts where you got a huge chunk of magical manuscripts. This one is just kind of in a collection by itself. He eventually decided to leave his collection to the Bodleian Library, because he had just had such a bad experience with the British Museum, and he left it all there, and that's where it's been for probably the last probably over 150 years.
Yeah, that's really it's crazy to me how long these things have been sitting around, with not many people really looking into them or having a lot of interest in them. And then now that there's this kind of occult and grimoire revival, all of these largely neglected manuscripts are coming back into the popular eye. And I'm curious about, when you started reading this manuscript, did you notice a lot of similarities between this and other works you had been working on, such as the Book of Oberon or Angels, Spirits, and Demons, as it being kind of like a cunning man's grimoire, or did you feel that this thing was wholly different?
I think it's hard to tell sometimes, but I was like, okay, so I can see some things in it. Well, we're thinking about this initial order that Joe Peterson and I put in. There's some material in there was very much that's from the Heptameron. Okay, that's from the Discovery of Witchcraft. But then there was material in there, there was this whole section on fairies, and that caught my attention, because wait a minute, what is this? Because we have these very interesting ideas about fairies from the period, but a lot of them kind of come in secondhand. It's you got Shakespeare, but does Shakespeare reflect what people thought about fairies? He is a century before, I know, but nonetheless, or various, you got Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft, but he's also kind of making fun of things. So And the question was, okay, so what did people who sincerely believed in fairies think? And so there were a few pages in there where I said, wait a minute, this is actually getting into that in a very interesting way. And I think everyone is probably familiar with Robert Kirk's and his Secret Commonwealth, where he's talking about it. This is about from the same time, but it's also got a very different sort of take on it, which is, Kirk is more like these are beings that are part of the world, and they eat and they sleep, and they have all these human-like traits, whereas this our unknown author pushes very much for like these as fallen angels, and this is what they are, and they're dangerous, and they will blast you if you cross them. So just be careful about that.
That now, like the Secret Commonwealth in Kirk is, I spent a lot of time studying into that whole body of fairy lore with stuff I'm doing. So this is kind of like a good OG, so to speak, dividing line between that idea where Christianized ideas of fairies and more traditional versus where he obviously went more to the historical, like these are legitimate beings, aerial beings, so to speak, that if not physical, almost Paracelsian, I guess. So what is, because I haven't read your book yet, what do you take away personally from the fairy lore aspect? Assuming we, from these two sides, I'm just curious to your impression on the fairies from these two.
You're going to get the immediate snarky view, which is stay away from fairies. They're going to blast you.
With a noisome breath.
Let me see if I can actually find that real quick. I know we're coming up on the end of our time, but I think we have something here. Where are my
We'll definitely be able to expand on this in the Patreon show.
Yeah. So you've got like the white fairies, which will sometimes make you unhealthy, but they're mostly okay, and you can usually get better. You've got the black fairies who they hit you and you're just going to be dead. You get the red fairies who can hurt you, and then you have to work with somebody and maybe help really pray to God hard and be able to resolve things. But yeah, this is not a view of fairies that people want to go out and talk to necessarily. Well, and of course, there are also rituals. There are also rituals in the book to summon fairies. So the author may not have taken that all that seriously.
Maybe it was one of those like, hey, you guys shouldn't do this.
Yeah,
but I always like to bring up whenever I hear people talking about working with fairies, I like to bring up actually from the Book of Oberon and the Cunning Man's Grimoire about the infamous ritual where you have to basically copulate with the Queen of the Fairies to get the Invisibility Cloak, which I find is just fascinating.
Yes.
And then you come back and you're like, well, that was fun, and then suddenly 200 years have passed, and you're like, well, all right then.
Well, the tricky part is that according to these works, like if you want the Ring of Invisibility, you have to do it in the proper order, because otherwise, if you don't take the ring first, then you're ritually impure, and then she can just leave.
Right. Yeah.
And you're stuck.
That's such an interesting, the entire field of it, especially with classic fairy lore and these specific things, just the most fascinating thing. And of course, some of the other subjects we discussed personally or on the show take a lot from classical fairy lore, and some of them even connect them to modern day experiences by all sorts of strange things, from UFO occupant encounters to hairy monsters to modern literal fairy lore. And then there's the distinct, I guess you want to call it the more neo-pagan-y view on fairies, and to me there's always been a stark distinction on the type of entities being described. But
there's a very heavy sort of brand of theosophy that kind of came in the 19th century and kind of transformed how a lot of people think of fairies. And now
seems the fairies heard about it maybe and have carried on the joke.
It's interesting because you will get, when people talk about fairy sightings, I was just listening to a podcast by Simon Young about this, where you've got, like fairies with wings. When did that start? And why do half the time do people see fairies with wings if they're going to report a fairy sighting, and half time they don't? And this is something that came into the lore. It was out there, but it may have come in very prominent in the lore very late. So
it was likely that, just to the what is it, the children, was it like the two girls who took the photograph?
The picture in the
Cottonley
early
Fairies,
1900s.
yeah.
Mhm, that one. I think that's actually probably where it started. Maybe not, I don't know, but I'm thinking, have you ever, in your travels, are you familiar with the old medieval, and I am leading somewhere with this, the old medieval legends of Magonia, the mythical other world or country?
It's been a while since I've read them.
Right, and that
yes.
was, yeah, and it was, I guess
There
it was
is-
fairly localized, but it was the idea that there were these ships with these aerial people that had much the same qualities as some of the medieval fairies. I'm not saying that this wasn't just utter folklore, even at the time, but
there is this trend in I think the High Middle Ages where people report whether those are, and once again, these could be for the purposes of entertainment, or they could be, people describing accounts. It's sometimes unclear, but in terms of distance, but where you are encountering beings, what seem to be people who aren't from around here,
right,
and trying to figure out, they don't, the accounts don't even match up necessarily, and they don't necessarily match up to what we know, what we perceive to be fairies, or what we think of as fairies, but they're out there.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I think the end of the Magonia story was it's an immensely interesting piece of folklore, but the actuality of it might have been more the peasants of that time saying that these sky people came down and stole all our food might have been a good reason why they couldn't give it to the crown or the landowner or something like that. Because I think the end of that story, the local bishop or whoever was recounting it, like they brought this, these stories on why they were acting away, these sky people and ships came down. He's like, you guys are silly, essentially, in more medieval phraseology. But you guys like, come on, just have you guys paid your taxes? And they're like, but we couldn't. They stole it. And they're like, go and pay your taxes. And it was like, people don't change, I suppose.
Yeah. And I think that, it's always good to think about those sort of factors when we talk about these stories, because I think we are used to being much closer to events and having, people who can, describe what they see. Whereas, a lot of these, what we see is that several, with regard to these older sources, we're several paces on the chain transmission away from them. Like this piece in this book, I found it in a much earlier source, in an earlier manuscript. So the question is how far back that goes. And I don't know. I know this person didn't, the person who, our unnamed author didn't write that. So it goes back to someplace. And then, so, there's some, that's the mystery.
And that's the draw to discover it.
So you have to ask how far back that goes and what, this seems to be part of a longer piece. So, what happened to that?
It's always got to be that nagging thought that it's possible that, somewhere in the world right now in somebody's private collection, the answer to that and so many questions could just exist. And it's just a matter of time, hopefully, before, maybe you are the one to get an email one day saying like, hey, I read this book and I have something that sounds a lot like what you have. Somebody who has no idea what they have. Now imagine
that would be wonderful. Yeah.
Hey, maybe you being on this podcast or talking about it, somebody's cousin's niece's boyfriend is listening to it in the car. They're like, it sounds like a book my uncle has or something. Like, you never know how these things work. But
yeah,
I am just fascinated with literary history, not just occult history. So, we are getting towards the end of our regular show. Would you be okay with sticking around for our Patreon episode?
Absolutely.
All right. Now for our listeners, I don't know if we're going to get to it tonight, but I can't help it. If Freighter Graves is willing, we might have a segment about more segments about fairies and some strange lights in the sky, as we were talking about before the show came on as well, if he's down for it. But I think we have a lot more to dig into your writing, because you have written some other books beside the ones we just went after. And I want to dig into your brain about Old Howard as well. But we can get to that in our Patreon.
Sure.
Before we get into Patreon, could you go into a little bit about the transmission between the fourth occult philosopher and Francis Dowse? Because I don't believe we highlighted that specific.
So I guess the question that I would ask is whether, the fourth occult philosopher, he has material in the book. Raphael has material in the book, but we don't know whether it ever made it to him. I do believe that let me see if I can recall the exact chain. I do apologize for like being kind of uncertain on details because I'd like to be really precise. This is the problem with being an author and an academic. I like to be really precise, and sometimes that doesn't work. But what I recall is that she had the book. She had a lot of monetary problems, as you could guess from what I was describing. And so at some point she loses it, and then it ends up being auctioned off. And the people who get the book know that it was in her possession at one time, but they kind of imply they don't know how long it was in her possession or if it went to somebody else. And we know that Dowse did buy it at that particular auction because he's got little penciled notes in the book that says, yeah, I bought it for this amount. And that's what's in the catalog. So, so that's, once again, we might have some other owners in there that we don't know about, and maybe someday we'll find out about them.
Yes, absolutely. I'm very, very excited to see if there's anything else that comes about from, after this book is released. Well, it's actually already released, right? It came out on the 8th.
Yes, it's out on the 8th. I had to check this today because Llewellyn was nice enough to send me advance copies, but it's out.
Awesome. Well, and people can pick that up from Amazon?
They can pick it up from Amazon or Llewellyn or from your local bookseller.
Okay, and then all of your other books are also in those places as well.
I do have my Necronomicon files is from Weiser. The Witch Bottles book is from Avalonia, and the Cthulhu Mythos Encyclopedia is currently from nobody. We're going to get out a new edition about that in about another year and a half, 2 years.
You better. Shakes fist.
Yes.
And where can people find other information about you and things things that you're involved in?
Let's see. I'm currently writing on Medium. So I think if you run a search for Dan Harms Medium, and then maybe talking something like Occult or Grimoire, you'll be able to find me there. I'm also on Facebook. I'm occasionally look at Twitter when I feel like punishing myself.
We don't even have a Twitter.
But I think those are the main places that you can find me and get in touch with me.
Awesome. Great. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for coming on. And as always, everyone, if you are not a patron, I highly recommend you sign up. It's only $4 a month, and you get access to the extra part of this episode. So we will see you all on there. And that was our interview with Daniel Harms. I really, really love talking to Daniel about this particular manuscript, as it is such an interesting and integral part of occult history over a large span of time, especially in a very critical period of time for magic and the occult. You can check out this book and other books on Llewellyn or on Daniel's Amazon page. He also writes on Medium, and all those links will be in the description below. If you are a Patreon, you will be able to enjoy the patron segment that is for this episode, where we expand on fairy magic, the fairies in the grimoires, and Lovecraft. For all of you who are not patrons, I highly recommend you sign up, because this is not something you want to miss. Otherwise, we will see you again on the Strange Dominions.